President Biden ordered the evacuation of U.S. Embassy employees on Sunday, where special forces swept in and out of the Capitol with helicopters on the ground for less than an hour. No shots were fired and no major casualties were reported, but thousands of private American citizens remain. Biden tweeted, "Today, on my orders, the United States military conducted an operation to extract U.S. government personnel from Khartoum in response to the situation in Sudan. I'm grateful for the commitment of our embassy staff and the skill of our service members who brought them to safety."
The evacuation comes as battles between two rival Sudanese commanders had forced the closing of the main international airport and left roads out of the country in control of armed fighters. The skirmishes have killed more than 400 people. Biden had ordered American troops to evacuate embassy personnel after receiving a recommendation from his national security team with no end in sight to the fighting. The White House said this morning that the situation in Sudan is not conducive for a large-scale military response at this time. Here to help us break down the situation is Alden Young, non-resident fellow at the Quinty Institute and political and economic historian of Africa. Welcome, Alden. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, regrettably, so much of Western media coverage is shallow, shall we say, with respect to foreign policy. So I wondered if you could take us a few steps back and help us understand what the origin of this conflict is.
The origins in Sudan, the conflict in Sudan, unfortunately, go back to the end of the Bashir regime, and particularly the long war in Darfur, which broke out in 2003. And unfortunately, international mediation in Sudan has often focused on bringing armed groups together and neglecting civil society. And in 2019, when the Bashir regime finally fell after 30 years of rule, through massive civil disobedience, civil protests, a huge outpouring across the country, the negotiations were done largely behind closed doors and brought to power several different armed movements, the Sudanese Armed Forces, which had been a backbone of Bashir's regime, and these militias that Bashir had created, paramilitias that Bashir had created during the long Sudanese civil wars that exist outside of the control of the regular armed forces. And General Hamdan Dagalo, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, is the leader of the largest militia in Sudan.
So these were two militia groups that helped to overturn the Bashir regime, and now the issue, as I understand it, is figuring out how to integrate these respective kind of paramilitary and military groups into one under kind of a more civilian leadership?
Unfortunately, for 4 years, there's been talk of a civilian transition, and both of these men, Abdel Fattah Burhan and Hamdan Dagalo, signed an agreement saying that they would turn over power to civilian authorities. They were supposed to be a 2-year interim period, but after 2 years, in October 2021, both of these men overthrew the civilian government. And while they claim that they're working for a civilian transition, and they frequently negotiate with international mediators, the U.S., the European Union, Saudi Arabia, UAE, saying that they want to bring about a civilian transition, there's been no sign that they actually want to bring about a civilian transition. And we have to remember that both of these men are creatures of the Bashir regime. They were the military backbone of Bashir, even if they participated in April 2019 in overthrowing the Bashir regime. So in many ways, we see a continuation of the kind of repressive military state that Bashir created.
So the State Department is evacuating U.S. diplomatic officials, but a lot of Americans remain in the country. What do you think is the current level of risk or danger for U.S. citizens who are there right now?
The risk is incredibly high. There were, by some estimates, 16,000 American citizens living in Sudan before the violence broke out about a week ago. Some of them have been able to reach the border by land to Egypt. There have been reports that some have been able to enter Ethiopia, though many people are being turned away from the Ethiopian border. Many people who do not have their correct or full documents with them, it's unable for them to leave. The situation in Khartoum is incredibly unstable. Fighting is happening in residential neighborhoods. Even the embassy staff of various countries have been attacked. UN staff has been attacked. And it took, a military intervention just to evacuate our own embassy personnel But I think it's really dangerous that we're leaving behind so many Americans. And I had hoped that maybe the Biden administration would take on the greater role of trying to reopen Khartoum International Airport.
So what would that take? I know that there was a healthy degree of skepticism about any efforts to involve American military in events overseas, although this crisis seems to be particularly problematic. It's acute. The crisis here is extreme. So what would it look like? What kind of capacity would the U.S. have to actually create the conditions where the airport could reopen?
I think it would take an intervention in which the U.S. would have to partially enforce a ceasefire between these two parties, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, which both claim to wish to have a ceasefire but have been constantly violating it, at least in central Khartoum, allowing humanitarian aid to re-enter the country and allowing those who wish to evacuate to leave. And I think it would have taken, it would take several hundred U.S. troops perhaps to secure the Khartoum airport, and we would need to bring in technical supplies, engineers to help repair the damaged airport. But I don't think it's something that's beyond American capacity, even using our forces in Djibouti.
Are there other countries who are looking to intervene because of a need to get their own people out? Are there other international players who might have more ability to do so or an obligation to do so? Or is it exclusively the U.S. who's being looked to right now to aid here?
I think other countries are also trying to bring their forces out. We've heard reports earlier today that Egypt is trying to begin an evacuation of its citizens. Egypt also has at least 10,000 residents in Khartoum who are at great risk and great danger. Many people, the alternative solution, since the international airports are closed and the trip to the land borders is quite difficult, have been going to other regions within Sudan. So people have been going to places like Wad Medani or other rural areas. And we're seeing a reversal of the kind of patterns that we saw in earlier conflicts in Sudan, where people flooded into the city. Now people are being forced to go into the countryside. But unfortunately, most of the hospitals in Sudan have been damaged. Many of them were in Khartoum, so the critical situation, people who have basic diseases like diabetes, for instance, might not be able we'll see rising casualties as they won't be able to receive treatment or medicine. The power grid has been deeply damaged. The water system has been damaged. And we're seeing reports that while earlier in the conflict, the telecommunication systems and internet have been viable, those are also fading. But I think it's hard it would be great if there was a multinational effort to restore Khartoum International Airport, perhaps with our allies like the Egyptians, the Emiratis, other African allies, perhaps Ethiopia or the AU could supply forces. And I think that would make it seem more neutral, because I think there's a great fear in Sudan that if, the Egyptians, for instance, were to intervene, that would be seen to be intervening on one side of the warring parties versus the other.
Well, here's White House National Security spokesman John Kirby speaking on the issue this morning.
And we just heard James say 16,000 Americans still in Sudan. What do we know about their condition? Are any further evacuation efforts planned?
Well, first of all, that number is an estimate. We're not actually have great confidence in that number precisely.
And we just heard James say 16,000 Americans still.
So there, Kirby saying that, we're not even sure exactly how many Americans there are. I guess that doesn't give a lot of confidence that we have a good plan to handle the situation if we don't even know the extent of the potential risk to our people, because we don't know how many there are.
I don't think we have a plan, unfortunately. And I think it's part of a larger pattern in which, though there's been a recent turn to Africa, there continues to be a large neglect. But these kind of conflicts are happening more and more. And so I think it's incumbent upon the U.S. government to develop better plans to evacuate. We saw this in Lebanon. We've seen, the leaving behind of Americans in places like Yemen. We saw the kind of chaotic evacuation out of Afghanistan. So I think this is something that the U.S. needs to add a higher priority to figuring out how it can return humanitarian aid in these crisis moments and help allow American citizens to evacuate.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alden Young. We really appreciate your insights into this.
Thank you again. Thank you for having me.